January 7th, 1941. The flagship Nagato swayed gently in the waters off Yokosuka Naval Base. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat at his desk in his quarters, a pen motionless in his hand above a blank sheet of paper. The memorandum needed a title, something bland enough to avoid attention from those who might oppose what he was about to propose. He wrote, Gumbai Ni Kansuru Shuriken. Views on military preparations. The blandness was deliberate. What he planned to write would overturn 2 decades of Japanese naval strategy, commit Japan to a course of action that violated everything he believed about war with the United States, and possibly seal the fate of his nation. But the emperor had made his decision. War was coming, and Yamamoto, as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, had a duty to plan for Japan's only chance at survival. He was 57 years old. 2 fingers on his left hand were missing, lost at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 when he had been a young ensign. That battle had taught Japan that surprise and decisive action could defeat a larger enemy. Now, 36 years later, he would have to apply that lesson against an enemy infinitely more powerful than Imperial Russia had ever been. Yamamoto dipped his pen and began to write. The first point addressed the need to expand Japan's air forces dramatically. Aircraft carriers would determine the outcome of any Pacific war, not battleships. He had been arguing this for years, watching with frustration as resources poured into the construction of the Yamato and Musashi, massive battleships that would be obsolete before they fired a shot in anger. The second point was harder to articulate. He wrote that fleet training had been based on the wait and react strategy, the classical defensive doctrine that had guided Japanese planning since the 1920s. According to this strategy, Japan would allow the American fleet to cross the Pacific, then engage them in a decisive gun battle somewhere near the Mariana Islands. The problem, Yamamoto wrote carefully, was that this strategy had never succeeded even in war games. The exercises were always called off before umpires deemed Japan's strength exhausted. More critically, the power of aircraft and submarines made it unlikely that such a decisive gun battle would ever occur. He paused. What he needed to write next was heresy, a preemptive strike, not defensive but offensive, not in Japanese waters, but at the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Yamamoto rose from his desk and walked to the porthole. The lights of Yokosuka reflected on the dark water. Beyond the harbor, beyond the Pacific, lay the United States. He had lived there, studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921, served as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He had traveled extensively across America, from the oil fields of Mexico to the factories of Detroit. He spoke English fluently. He understood Americans better than anyone in the Japanese military establishment. That understanding was his burden. He knew what his colleagues in the Army and most of his fellow naval officers did not. That war with the United States was not just dangerous, it was suicidal. America's industrial capacity dwarfed Japan's. Its oil reserves were inexhaustible compared to Japan's 2-year supply. Its population was larger, its resources more abundant, its ability to sustain a long war absolute. He had said as much to Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono just 4 months earlier. When asked about the outcome of a war with the United States, Yamamoto had been brutally honest. If ordered to fight, I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd and 3rd years. The Prime Minister had not wanted to hear it. The Army generals had not wanted to hear it. Japan was committed to expansion into Southeast Asia, to securing the oil and rubber of the Dutch East Indies, to solving its resource crisis through conquest. And the United States had made clear it would not tolerate such aggression. The oil embargo imposed in July 1940 was strangling Japan. War was not a choice anymore. It was an inevitability. Yamamoto returned to his desk. If war was inevitable, then Japan's only hope was the strategy he had been formulating since late 1940. Deal the Americans a catastrophic blow at the war's outset. Destroy their Pacific fleet in harbor before it could mobilize. By time, 6 months perhaps, for Japan to seize the resource areas of Southeast Asia and establish a defensive perimeter so formidable that the Americans would negotiate rather than pay the blood price of breaking it. It was a fantasy, and Yamamoto knew it. Americans did not negotiate after being attacked. They mobilized. They fought. They won. He had seen their capacity for industrial production firsthand. He had studied American history. He knew what had happened after Fort Sumter, after the Maine, after the Lusitania. The United States, once awakened to war, did not stop until victory was complete. But what else could he do? Refuse to plan? Resign? He had considered it. But resignation would accomplish nothing except to hand command to someone with less understanding of the enemy, someone who might believe Japan could actually win a prolonged war. At least Yamamoto knew the truth. At least he could plan for the best possible beginning, even if the ending was already written. He wrote the third section of his memorandum, outlining the concept of a carrier-based air attack on Pearl Harbor. The technical challenges were immense. Pearl Harbor was shallow, only 40 feet deep in most places. Standard torpedoes would hit the bottom before arming. The British attack on Taranto in November 1940 had proven shallow water torpedo attacks were possible, but Taranto had been a much smaller operation. Pearl Harbor would require at least 4 aircraft carriers, perhaps 6, launching hundreds of aircraft in coordinated waves. The distance from Japan was over 3,000 miles, far beyond any operation the Imperial Navy had ever attempted. The attack would have to achieve complete surprise. If the Americans detected the approaching fleet, the carriers would be destroyed and Japan would lose the war before it began. The fleet would have to maintain absolute radio silence, refuel at sea, approach from the north where American patrols were weakest, and strike on a Sunday morning when the American fleet would be in harbor and the crews at minimal readiness. Even if everything went perfectly, Yamamoto knew the attack could not win the war. It could only buy time. The memorandum did not say this explicitly. It presented the Pearl Harbor operation as Japan's best strategic option, given the circumstances. But Yamamoto's private correspondence told a different story. In a letter he had written in January 1940, a year earlier, he had been even more blunt. Should hostilities break out between Japan and the United States, it is not enough that we take Guam and the Philippines or even Hawaii and San Francisco. We would have to march into Washington and sign the treaty in the White House. I wonder if our politicians who speak so lightly of a Japanese-American war have confidence as to the outcome and are prepared to make the necessary sacrifices. The military had circulated that letter with the final sentence omitted, turning Yamamoto's warning into apparent boastfulness. In America, it had been interpreted as a threat that Japan would conquer the continental United States. The distortion infuriated him, but he kept his anger private. Public disagreement with national policy would accomplish nothing except his removal from command. Yamamoto finished the memorandum as dawn light began filtering through the porthole. He sealed it and summoned his aide to deliver it to Navy Minister Oikawa Koshiro. Then he sat back in his chair, exhausted not from the night's work, but from the weight of what he had set in motion. He knew what would happen next. The Naval General Staff would oppose the plan. Admiral Nagato Osami and his staff were wedded to the defensive strategy, to the doctrine of waiting for the Americans and engaging them in Japanese waters. They would argue that the Pearl Harbor operation was too risky, too complex, too dependent on factors beyond Japanese control. They would be right. The plan was all of those things. But Yamamoto also knew he would prevail, not through logic or persuasion, but through the threat of resignation. The Naval General Staff could not imagine going to war without him at the helm of the combined fleet. His reputation, his prestige, his understanding of naval aviation, these made him indispensable. He would use that leverage ruthlessly if necessary. The irony was bitter. Yamamoto, who opposed war with the United States more forcefully than anyone in the Japanese military, would become the architect of the attack that made that war inevitable. Yamamoto, who understood better than anyone that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict, would plan the operation that ensured the conflict would be prolonged by enraging the American public beyond any possibility of negotiation. He rose and walked to his desk drawer, removing a flask of sake. He poured a small cup and drank it in one swallow, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. Outside, the morning watch was changing. Sailors moved across the deck of the Nagato, beginning another day in the life of the fleet. Most of them had no idea what was coming. They trusted their leaders to make wise decisions, to keep Japan safe, to honor the sacrifices that might be required of them. Yamamoto thought of his own family, his wife Reiko, and their 4 children. The marriage had been distant for years, more an obligation than a partnership, but he still felt the weight of what his planning might mean for them. If the war went as he feared, Japan would be destroyed. Not just defeated, but reduced to ruins. American bombers would eventually reach Tokyo. He was certain of it. The city would burn. His family might burn with it. He poured another cup of sake, but did not drink it. Instead, he stared at the amber liquid, thinking about all the decisions that had led to this moment. The Russo-Japanese War, which had taught Japan it could defeat a Western power. The Treaty of Versailles, which had denied Japan the recognition it felt it deserved. The Great Depression, which had devastated Japanese agriculture and fed resentment toward the zaibatsu and the politicians. The war in China, which had started as a limited operation and metastasized into an endless occupation. The tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, which Yamamoto had opposed, but which had bound Japan to the Axis powers. Each decision had seemed rational at the time to those who made it. Each had narrowed Japan's options, and now the options had collapsed to a single point. War with the United States, a war Japan could not win, planned by a man who knew it could not be won. Was there an alternative? Could he refuse? Could he resign and speak publicly about the folly of this course? He knew the answer. Such action would be seen as betrayal, as cowardice. The ultranationalists who had already threatened his life would make good on those threats. And his replacement would plan the war anyway, probably with less skill and certainly with less awareness of the enemy's true strength. No, his duty was clear. Plan the best possible beginning. Make it so devastating that Japan's leaders might reconsider their course even after war began. Strike with such force that the Americans, seeing the cost of fighting across the Pacific, might actually negotiate. It was a slim hope, almost no hope at all, but it was the only hope Japan had. Yamamoto drank the second cup of sake and set the cup down with deliberate care. He would need to be careful in the coming months. The plan would face opposition not just from the Naval General Staff, but from elements within the combined fleet itself. Many of his own subordinates doubted that such a long-range carrier operation was possible. They would need to be convinced through demonstration and drill. He would order the formation of the First Air Fleet in April, combining carrier divisions 1 and 2 into a single formation. This had been discussed for years as a revolutionary step in naval aviation. Now, it would become reality, justified as a general improvement in fleet organization, but actually designed to create the strike force necessary for Pearl Harbor. Training would begin immediately. Torpedo bombers would practice shallow water attacks at Kagoshima, where the harbor conditions resembled Pearl Harbor. Dive bombers would train to strike ships at anchor with armor-piercing bombs modified from battleship shells. Fighter pilots would practice long-range escort missions. All of it would be explained as routine training, normal preparation for the defense of the empire. And all the while, Yamamoto would know that he was preparing for a battle that could only end in disaster. 6 months of victories, perhaps a year. The Philippines would fall. Malaya would fall. The Dutch East Indies would be secured. Japan would control the resources it needed. But then the American industrial machine would fully mobilize. New aircraft carriers would be launched, dozens of them. New aircraft would fill the skies, thousands of them. New ships, new submarines, new weapons beyond anything Japan could produce would pour forth from American factories. And then Japan would begin losing. Island by island, mile by mile, the Americans would advance. Japanese sailors would die by the thousands. Japanese pilots would be shot from the skies. Japanese cities would burn. And at the end, when Japan had nothing left, the Americans would demand unconditional surrender. Yamamoto could see it all as clearly as if it had already happened. The knowledge was a physical weight in his chest, making it difficult to breathe. But he would carry that knowledge alone. To share it would be to break the morale of his subordinates, to undermine the discipline of the fleet, to commit a form of treason against the nation he served. So he would plan Pearl Harbor. He would make it brilliant. He would make it devastating. And when the operation succeeded, when the American battleships lay burning in the shallow water and the American public screamed for revenge, Yamamoto would know that he had just signed his nation's death warrant. The aide returned with a receipt for the memorandum. Yamamoto dismissed him and sat alone in his quarters as the sun rose higher. He thought about writing to his children, explaining to them why their father had done what he was about to do. But what could he say? That duty demanded he plan for a war he knew Japan would lose. That loyalty to the emperor meant betraying his better judgment. That love of country required him to set in motion the destruction of everything he loved. There were no words for such contradictions. There was only duty, executed with skill and determination regardless of personal cost. Yamamoto had been a warrior all his life. He had shed blood for Japan at Tsushima. He had studied the art of war for decades. Now, at the culmination of his career, he would demonstrate that mastery by planning an attack that tactical brilliance could not save from strategic catastrophe. He wondered if the Americans would understand after it was over. Would historians recognize that the man who planned Pearl Harbor had also been its most reluctant architect? Would they see that Yamamoto had tried to prevent the war he was forced to plan? Or would history remember only the attack itself, the surprise, the burning ships, the beginning of a war that would consume the Pacific? It did not matter. History would judge as it would judge. Yamamoto's responsibility was not to history, but to the men under his command, to the nation he served, to the duty that defined his existence. If that duty required him to plan for disaster while hoping for miracle, then that was what he would do. The morning watch had ended. New sailors moved across the deck. Life aboard the Nagato continued as it always had, with routines and drills and the careful maintenance that kept a warship ready for battle. Most of the crew would learn about Pearl Harbor only days before the attack force departed. Until then, they would continue their normal duties, unaware that their admiral had just set in motion events that would determine their fates. Yamamoto stood and straightened his uniform. There was much to do, officers to consult, plans to refine, the naval general staff to convince, or, failing that, to coerce through threat of resignation. The work would consume the next 10 months, requiring every bit of skill and determination he possessed. But in the end, Japan would have its plan for war, and Yamamoto would have the knowledge that he had done his duty, even knowing it would not be enough. He walked to the door of his quarters, paused, and looked back at his desk where the memorandum had been written. In that moment, he allowed himself one brief acknowledgement of what he truly felt. Not confidence, not determination, not hope. Only resignation to the inevitable and profound sadness for what was to come. Then he opened the door and stepped into the corridor, his face composed, his bearing commanding. He was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. His doubts and fears were irrelevant. Japan needed a plan for war, and he would provide the best plan possible. The rest was in the hands of fate. The memorandum dated January 7th, 1941 reached the Naval General Staff in May of that year, precipitating 9 months of bitter controversy that would only be resolved in October when Yamamoto threatened to resign unless the Pearl Harbor operation was approved in its entirety. The attack succeeded brilliantly on December 7th, 1941, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and killing over 2,400 Americans. It also enraged the American public beyond any possibility of negotiation, exactly as Yamamoto had feared. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, at the Battle of Midway, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers in a single day. The turning point Yamamoto had predicted with such precision had arrived. For the next 2 years, Japan retreated across the Pacific, losing island after island, battle after battle, exactly as Yamamoto had foreseen. On April 18, 1943, American code breakers intercepted his flight plans. Fighter aircraft ambushed and shot down his plane over the Solomon Islands. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto died instantly, never knowing whether his death was mercy or justice. Understanding the weight of impossible choices isn't about judging. It's about recognizing the human cost of historical turning points. If this story has given you a different perspective on decisions made under the harsh conditions of war, don't forget to subscribe, comment, and like. Every story we share is based on careful research in a moments when individuals face the full weight of their responsibilities. Thank you for watching.